Why don't you kick us off with a reading?
So I published this essay in the New York Times on April of 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic was raging in the US and when the lockdowns just started. It is a conversation between my mother and I. My mother lives in China. And so 11 years ago, when I was preparing to leave China, my mother impelled me to do two things: get baptized and join the Chinese Communist Party. She was petrified at the thought of me alone in a foreign country. She wanted me to carry the memberships like talismans so that the most two powerful entities in the world and the next would bless my journey. I fulfilled neither of her wishes. I am not a communist and I do not believe in God. I am a scientist and a writer. It is the responsibility of my vocations to ask the questions obscured by simplified answers. But what happens when the questions I ask can never be answered? When a puzzle has no solution? When every option is wrong? It is now the beginning of April, and the United States has the most reported cases of COVID-19 in the world. On the first day that the people of Illinois were put under a shelter-in-place order, when the clock struck 7 p.m., thousands of Chicago residents walked to their balconies to sing Bon Jovi's "Living on a Prayer." As dusk sets over the city I call home today, it is a new morning for my mother in China. I can picture her standing in our old kitchen, her graying hair tied up in a messy bun. She adds up nuts and dried fruits to her congee. She reads the news from state media. The kettle chirps on the stove. She fills 2 thermal flasks with hot water and looks out of the window. She thanks God for her meal and asks him to look after her only child. My inbox will soon light up again with messages from my mother. She will continue to write while I sleep. I imagine a tunnel opening up through the planet, where our thoughts meet.
Yangyang Cheng was born and raised in Hefei, received a PhD in physics from the University of Chicago, and has worked at the Large Hadron Collider. She's currently a fellow at the Yale Law School. I won't burden her by saying she's the voice of a generation, but she's at the very least a voice of a generation, having written over the past few years shockingly beautiful and incisive series of essays. She's one of the most thoughtful observers of the human tensions at the core of the U.S.-China relationship and should have had a book deal yesterday. Co-hosting today is Alex Liang, a senior at Yale. Yangyang, thank you so much for coming on China Talk.
Thank you so much, Jordan, and many thanks to Alex as well.
I don't want to do your entire backstory because I think you've captured it in your essays far better than I ever could through a series of questions. But I am very curious to learn about your most recent professional decision to take a break from teaching and quarks and neutrons and go hang out at New Haven to write about stuff. What prompted you to take that decision, and how's it been going so far?
I'll answer it this way, that first of all, it was not like an impulsive decision. And I've written and talked about this, that had I grown up in a free society, I probably would not have become a physicist. As a young child, I was interested in a lot of things, but I realized at a very early age that because of the political conditions in China, the physical sciences among my interests was the only profession I could pursue without compromise. And I've really enjoyed my career in physics, and I still do love the profession deeply. But as I've also told my PhD advisor several years ago when I was about to graduate, that I've always viewed my physics career as that of a professional athlete. I love the profession. I wanted to be the best I can while I'm still in the field, but I do not see it necessarily as a lifelong one, that at some point that I'll leave the immediacy of it and then do something else. However, like being an athlete, once an athlete, always an athlete. It shapes your body and also it shapes your mind. It shapes the way you move through the world and interact with things and think about things. And I think that is how being a physicist is still one of the core components of my identity. And I think my the career transition, it's a long time coming. But I think also last year with the COVID-19 pandemic, one year in isolation also helped clarify a lot of things that I felt it was the right time to make this transition. It was not out of any opportunistic calculations, and it was probably a really, really hard time to make this transition. And I'm really grateful to Yale for this opportunity. But I think it's the political conditions in my birth country and my adopted home, U.S.-China relations, and also just global conditions in general that touch intimately on identity, on borders, on the use of science and technology and its relationship with the state. That I feel it's something urgent, and it's something that demands my full attention and energy. And so that's why I made this transition.
Going from a sort of having physics to, let's not say distract you, but maybe like take your mind off, put perspective on these sort of issues in the US-China relationship. What is it? Has the relationship to these issues for you changed at all now that you've had, 12 hours in a day to sort of think and meditate and research on these sorts of questions?
Yeah, that is a really, really good question. And it's something that that I feel quite intimately this year, that before physics, especially that I was trained as an experimental particle physicist, I study the most fundamental questions about nature, about the origins and evolutions of the universe. And I think here I should point out that science as a human endeavor and as a primarily government-funded human endeavor is inherently political. So I do not want to paint this picture as if because I was trained in particle physics, that my former profession was apolitical or somehow beyond and above politics. However, there is something like in the immediacy of the questions I was asking, there is still like sometimes like an oasis or refuge that I can tuck myself away into for a bit, and away from the more pressing issues that intimately touch on my body, on my being. However, I think I was aware of what my current profession would demand intellectually, emotionally, and I would say physically. And I still think it was the right choice.
So Yangyang, in one of your pieces, there is a line that really struck me. It goes, I was at dinner with a friend and she asked about my work. Quote, name one thing you wish Americans knew about China. And you said that Chinese people are people. This is pretty striking. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I just published this essay in The Guardian, and I think it is, and it's something that is really interesting after I published it. And one of my colleagues messaged me to say that he heard almost the exact same exchange, word for word, on NPR when it was discussing Haiti and Haitian refugees. And so I think there are multiple dimensions to this. I think later on in our conversation, we will touch more on U.S.-China relations and more specifics about China and Chinese people, and how this place or how this ethnicity on the community are being viewed. But here I would like to say that this is it's something that is beyond the immediacy of U.S.-China relations or great power rivalry. And being able to see it's something that actually is more about how one understands the self. Does one need to somehow constrain the other and to be able to draw this kind of a boundary in order to be able to understand oneself? And I think this is something that is almost one of the most urgent questions in the world today. And I refer to, for example, the philosopher Judith Butler when she writes about frames of war. And war is such a mandatory binary that demands dehumanizing the other. And so she asks these questions of when is a life, when is a loss, what makes for a grievable life. So I think be able to think about Chinese people as people, think about Haitians as people, is really about thinking about how all lives have value and have equal amount of humanity, and be able to see that they are equally grievable in this world.
Yangyang, was there a process of you learning to think of Americans as people?
I think there are two layers to this. The first is in a national frame, that I think when I became aware of Americans when I was very young, I don't think that they were foreigners, but I didn't feel that they abided to any character. Like if I just didn't know enough about them, then I just didn't know, but I didn't really have any preconditioned stereotypes. I think for my parents' generation, maybe because they were influenced by the Korean War and the rhetorics of that era, would probably have had a stronger probably a negative feeling towards Americans. And I know that here, now with the deteriorating U.S.-China relations and with Chinese government becoming more authoritarian and in Chinese society becoming more nationalistic, there is also an increasing tendency to paint this demonized caricature of foreigners and Americans in particular. So this is on a national framework. But I think another layer of the framework is really a racialized framework. And I think that is very important. And I wish it had come out more in both in the limited space of this piece and in the discussions around this piece as well. Is that I think James Baldwin has written about this, of how just like as an American, but as a Black American, how Black people know much more about white people than white people know about Black people. And so this is something about like being in the center and being used to being in the center and taking one's own experience as the norm and assuming that one's own worldview is universal. And that is something that is related to privilege and to relations of power. And if we relate that to China, people and Chinese society are also not immune to racism, ethnic hierarchies, and xenophobia. And as a Han Chinese woman, I also need to examine this analogy of how in China, I never questioned my Chineseness because I'm Han, and how when we are seeing these oppressions and crackdowns on ethnic minorities, in particular on the Uyghur population, and as well as the Tibetans, and also to an extent to Hong Kong, that can be analyzed through this lens as well, is to how to think about one's these social constructs, one's racialized identity. What place in this power hierarchy does one's identity lie, and what that means in terms of one's relationship to the self and to the others.
What advice do you have for folks who, want to work towards accepting Chinese people as people? Like, are there novels you recommend? How does one go down the path of like being as sort of thoughtful and open as one Yangyang?
I might answer it this way as a flipping this question, right? What does one gain by imagining other people as less than people? What is needed in this process, right? And so I think that is the more important thing. Why is this racial construct and this racial hierarchy necessary? Whose interest does it serve? Does it serve the development of capitalism, as like Cedric Robinson wrote about how the development of capitalism in Europe was tied with these racialized identities? And does it contribute to a national project? And as I mentioned earlier about I'm Han Chinese and how the Chinese government is increasingly trying to mandate this a singular way, the singular politically correct way to be Chinese. So I think these are the questions that are more important to ask. That of course it is very important for an individual to examine one's own biases, but race and structural racism is not merely about individual sentiments. It's really about structures and relations of power. And so that is the more fundamental question that we need to ask. And if there are indeed unjust structures of power that are upholding these racialized hierarchies, then it's these structures of power that we need to contest.
Which is a big burden for a postdoc at Yale Law School, is it not?
But it's not an individual burden, right? It is a responsibility as an individual, and also a responsibility as an intellectual. And so I do not want to say anything self-aggrandizing as if I'm like singularly taking on this. And I hope that I'm not making this impression. Actually, like I am a student of this, that I learned a lot from generations of scholars, activists, writers, artists who have been in the trenches all among the bookshelves, who have produced these records, these scholarships, and as well as a lot of these lessons that I myself am trying to learn from. And of course, historical lessons do not contain ready-made answers for the future. And what kind of answers and what kind of map we chart for the future is the responsibility of people of this generation.
You have this beautiful line in one of your essays. The language I speak, Standard Mandarin, is as old as Chinese civilizations and as young as the modern Chinese state, which, stands in for just a broader feeling, which you and I probably both have when you see China referred to in political discourse as such a sort of distilled down, simplistic, one-dimensional entity, where all the people and the culture and the history are just reduced to whatever ex-politician, think tanker decides is the sort of meaning of it. What is to be done? How does that make you feel? Is there any answer? Is there something inevitable about the way this sort of treatment of China in the popular discourse nowadays in the West?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an urgent one with a lot of stakes, right? And I think, okay, so I'll answer this from two aspects. The first with regards to how quote unquote the West imagines China. And I think that's interesting because the West is an imperfect phrase, but I actually sometimes use it deliberately because I would quote the Caribbean philosopher Eduardo Glissant, who said that, the West is not in the West. It's a project, not the place. So the West, the very creation of the West is aligned with state interests, with capital interests, with imperial interests, and with power structures. And so in a lot of cases, it actually becomes an interesting and useful entity to talk about. On the other hand, so what is China? And this is where, coming to my second point, and as you quoted this line that I wrote about also in The Guardian earlier this year, about whether or not one needs to speak Chinese to know China. And I think language, right? Language is not a neutral thing. And language is a tool of power, and it contains history. It has context. And the Chinese language, through its and really it's not Chinese language, but Chinese languages, and through history and in its modern form, are all closely aligned with nation building, with projects of the state, and with power. And so, and it's an evolving thing. It's not something that is set in place, and the identities associated with it are also fluid. And so I think there is so much richness in this, and just from Chinese languages or Sinitic and non-Sinitic languages spoken in the region that we know as China today. And from that, if we just flatten all of those into a geopolitical concept, which benefits a lot of Western state interests, but also to a great extent benefits the Chinese state interest, is really a great loss, not just for Chinese people or Chinese culture, but for humanity and for history. And so I think it is, for myself, I was born and raised in China. I am a Chinese citizen, but I regard my Chinese identity as that of a cultural and linguistic belonging. It is not something that is dictated by the state. And in a lot of my writings, I'm also trying to contest that, to wrestle and to reclaim my Chinese identity away from the very narrow, one-dimensional, flattened concepts created by the state, whether or not that is the Chinese government or the US government or some other geopolitical powers.
I just want to pause here and reflect on the fact that you've now referenced like 4 social thinkers, political philosophers, which are pretty deep cuts. And I just want to know how you pick which books to read. It seems like there are, many sort of, well, let's just stop there. Yangyang, how do you pick which books to read?
I don't know. I always feel like I always feel illiterate. Because of course, like I was born and raised in China, and then I didn't speak English until adolescence. And then also when I was growing up, actually my family banned extracurricular reading. My mother in particular, because she felt that it's necessary that I spend all awake hours focused on schoolwork. And it's also like something that I try to rebel against. But I also understand that it's something that was something she did out of actual like love, but she believed and she knew, and I also understood that the only path for individual advancement coming from my background is through academic excellence. And so I think I've tried to read more since I moved to the US, but it's always a work in progress. And I think in terms of the books I read now, they're more related. Okay, so I'm going to quote James Baldwin again when he said that when you think I will paraphrase it slightly, that when you think your pain and suffering are unique in the world, and then you read. And so I think a lot of times when I read is that I have questions, but I don't think I'm like that. I am an individual, but I'm not that unique of an individual. These are questions that concern more than me, and it's concerned more than this place and time. And so I try to go to other thinkers and other writers or activists at different times and places and see, and their experiences, of course, are not entirely the same as mine, but this is where these comparisons, analogies, and become necessary and become informative, and so yeah. I think it's I'm always feeling this urgency that there is so much to read and to learn. So I don't consider myself well read at all.
It is notable that the sort of 5 thinkers that have come to the top of your head from my random list of questions have all been Western. I'm sorry, have all been non-Chinese. I'm curious, like, do you find 20th and 21st century of thinking in Mandarin to be less interesting, or what has drawn to you to it seems spend most of your time reading foreigners?
This is a great question. Well, I think the first is just because of language that we're speaking English, and so the English and the English language writers are the first that come to mind. But the second part, I think, as I mentioned earlier as well, right? Like language is not politically neutral; it's a tool of power, and so I do read more in the English language now than I do read Chinese, or I read Chinese probably less of the contemporary day, probably of earlier days, and more on poetry or literature, or but I think because a lot of the questions that we are discussing now relates to how the West views China, or with regards to U.S.-China relations, right? So this is about and so a lot of my answers or my thinking that I look at how other non-white entities, whether it's Black people here in the U.S. or other decolonial and anti-colonial struggles around the world, contest whiteness, contest Western hegemony. And so I think that is probably why that these writers and thinkers have been brought up more in the context of this conversation. That, as I also mentioned, they do not come from the same background as I do, and their struggles and their thinking, their lessons are very informative to me. But what they did, and also like their accomplishments as well as regrets and at times failures or mistakes, they do not contain ready-made answers, but they provide a historical perspective and as well as a theoretical framework that I find useful in my thinking.
I'm pretty sure Yale Law School doesn't make you teach right now, but if they did, what are some course ideas and who would you want to put on the syllabus? And are there any interesting Chinese and non-Chinese thinkers you would want to pair for any courses, for any class sessions?
Interesting. So not to make this too long an answer, but I think like one course that I've actually wanted to teach if I were given the opportunity, and this is something that I would relate more to China, is that there can be an interesting course on examining the relationship between science and scientists vis-a-vis the Chinese state across Chinese history over millennia, from the early imperial times to the very present day. And in this process, there are also comparative things that can be done. For example, early Chinese science and scientists compared with early Greek science and scientists of the similar era, and later on, and also like because science and technology in China has never been an insular affair, like through history, but how it is being used and how much it is indigenous versus an import is very much also related with the political and socioeconomic conditions of the time. And I think that would be actually an interesting like seminar course on segmented into different times and then to the present day into different disciplines. So there is an idea there. And then in that, we can also read a lot of Chinese thinkers from even like earlier eras writing about astronomy in its relationship, pre-modern astronomy in relation with the state, the body, the state, and the cosmos as reflections of each other, up to, let's say, the 19th century during the self-strengthening movement, how some of the writers and also politicians are thinking about the role of Western technology, in particular military technology, for self-strengthening, and then later for national salvation. And then to the present day, there is also a lot of primary sources, Chinese language sources, as well as English language sources that we can read through this.
Sign me up. Here's so this is a good transition, to talk about some of the tensions in the U.S.-China scientific relationship, which have really come to the fore over the past few years, for sure.
Yangyang, as a particle physicist and as researching fundamental science, how have you seen this relationship, this U.S.-China increasing tensions? How have you seen that affect like the fundamental sciences as a particle physicist yourself?
So I'm sorry, I think you're referring to tensions as in what specific tensions?
How there's like concerns about civil rights when the DOJ has this China initiative that they announced in 2018. There's also concerns about like from a House Oversight Committee launching an investigation and calling what's going on in fundamental science kind of a new Red Scare. Do you have any takes on this?
So I'm not particularly comfortable with the terminology "new Red Scare," and then I actually think this terminology, I can understand why people who genuinely care about civil rights may and are concerned about this scrutiny on Chinese scientists in the U.S. or just scientists in the U.S. with collaborations or different kinds of relations with Chinese organizations or individuals, placing this extra scrutiny, and then at some point with rather compelling evidence of racial profiling, and then use this Red Scare to alert the American public to an earlier era. I can see how that may be unhelpful. But I really don't think it is a particularly precise term, and it may mislead more. Like during like the Red Scare, what is red? Red is referring to communism, and that during the Red Scare, it was the tension was about ideology, and the Cold War was and the Soviet Union. That was very different. Just socioeconomically, politically, and also in terms of its ideological agendas, very different from China today. And the conditions of the world was also very different when the Soviet Union was largely by its own design closed off to the rest of to the West. And then the Red Scare itself was also, it's not particularly technology focused. This was about people with communist, with political beliefs that are on the left, and artists and writers and actors and also labor organizers and civil rights activists. And so that was the context of that. And so both in terms of the other, quote unquote, the adversary or the enemy is different. China is nominally communist, but it's not. It is very much integrated and important player in the global capitalist system. And the Chinese government, run by an ostensibly Chinese Communist Party, is actually a major player in global capitalism and trying to crack down on socialist labor organizing and other forms of grassroots struggles inside China and as well. And so the red part is misleading, and I think it is actually quite problematic that it paints like now a country becomes red. What does it mean? And then the scare part, right? What is the U.S. afraid of? Now, like the fear is not that people in the U.S. are becoming communists, because Chinese society is not communist either. And the primary ideology that underlies the Chinese government's legitimacy is nationalism. And it's something that it's not something the Chinese government is trying to export. It's not people in the U.S. are becoming a nationalist towards China. But by framing this into a great power struggle as a national rivalry, it's flaming nativist, nationalistic, xenophobic sentiments here in the U.S. And so I think like this new Red Scare, though I can see why some people who use it are well-intentioned, but I do think that is actually quite problematic and do not capture what is the current situation, which is about state power and state rivalry, and how science and technology are being seen as these tools of state power by both governments and scientists being regarded as these assets in geopolitics. And then the second part, so coming to science and fundamental research, I think this is also important to view this as not something that is limited in place or time. If you say how, or I worked on the Large Hadron Collider for 11.5 years, and it's a large international collaboration. The collider itself is located in Europe and literally on the French-Swiss border. And it's the collaboration has dozens of countries, hundreds of institutes, and thousands of scientists from across the world. Though if we actually look at the number of institutes with their national affiliation, we could also see this disparity that it's predominantly countries and institutes located in Western Europe and in North America. On the other hand, because it is such a large international collaboration, and the particle physics, I think it's in particular, so it becomes a good example, like when racial sentiments, racist sentiments, xenophobic sentiments are inflamed in the U.S., it would have a negative impact. And that is first and foremost, because scientists are also people and have multiple layered identities in addition to being a scientist. And so, for example, the Trump administration's Muslim ban had a very direct impact on science and scientists, including on many of my colleagues who come from majority Muslim countries, whether or not it is explicitly on that banned list. And so I think, and of course, the U.S.-China tensions have an impact on fundamental sciences. It's in fields that are like in my field of particle physics, because it is fundamental research with no applicable value. It may not be as acute with other applied fields or all these disciplines that are regarded as sensitive or related with national security, but it's all related. And I think the important thing here is to be able to place this current tension into a broader context and tease out the different strands, which are nationalistic and informed by great power rivalry, which are racist and are not directly tied, though it overlaps with geopolitics, and which are broader, that really transcends national, racial, or political boundaries, and are about fundamental questions of what kind of science is being done, what are the social costs, who benefits from this work, who funds this work, and what are the civic duties of a scientist. Is that limited to the government of one's birth country, the government of the country one works in, or is there some broader egalitarian value that as a global scientific community we should strive for?
Yangyang, I want to take a little detour into the Large Hadron Collider. Well, maybe not into it, but first a story and then a question. So for whatever random reason, I was in Geneva the day they announced that they found the Higgs boson and had the chance to party with all of those physicists that night. A few of my friends were interns there, and it was just like the most incredible moment of all these people from all around the world just like being really happy. And, I think there's some vision baked into the Large Hadron Collider and those sorts of like international scientific projects, which is really antithetical to a lot of the discourse, both in the US and in China, when it comes to the purpose of science and like the reason that nations put money into these sorts of projects. In China, it's all about sort of self-reliance and making China great again. In the US, we have this rhetoric around, internet, competitiveness but at the same time, there's something like, I guess as an outside observer, just like something really pure and beautiful about humanity. The fact that like the world got together and built the Large Hadron Collider. Am I missing something? Like, is there something special in there? In that community? What's your take from the inside? And if you were going to pause and spend 2 years writing about all the themes that came out of your experience in that community, what are some of the threads you'd like to unspurl?
It's such a great question. It's such a lovely story. When Higgs boson discovery was discovered, actually it was not July 4th.
Yes, it was not July, and that's why we had something planned. But we're like, we can't have hamburgers because that's too like imperialist. We should, have like some world food.
And I was a very, very new grad student at University of Chicago at the time, but I also did like wake up at 3 a.m. to watch the live stream, and I think, okay, so this is a great question. I think I think we should acknowledge the ideals and also point out the constraints of reality, and also with some reference to the history, right? Like CERN was founded in the mid 1950s. In CERN is the European Center for Nuclear Research, which is where the Large Hadron Collider is located, and it was founded as a fundamental scientific research center, but it also had a very explicit, from its founding, a very explicit geopolitical goal. But this was very much like aligned with the context of politics on the European continent shortly after World War II. This is a continent that had been ravaged by war, and then so nations and individual national governments and individuals came together and thought, like, if there will be a fundamental scientific project that can help unite to some extent these countries that have been trying to decimate each other for so long, and so the choice to build it literally on the border at the Swiss-French border is a reflection of that. And so it does have a cosmopolitan ideal, and as you mentioned, I myself mentioned, right? It is a large international collaboration with dozens of member countries and hundreds of institutions from around the world. And I think that was one of the things that really drew me to particle physics when I was still an undergraduate student in China. Partly I was really curious about these fundamental questions about nature. Partly I was amazed by the majestic instrumentation, and I've always been interested, and I do worked a lot on hardware side of it. And then finally, there is also the aspect that I was intrigued by the nature of the collaboration. How can people from such diverse backgrounds and nationalities and a lot of these countries are not very friendly with each other for a very long time, and also in the present sense can work together on something that is beyond immediate utilitarian purposes. And I think these are is an inspirational example. But then where I would come to the pragmatic part of it is that I do not want to make the impression that somehow sun is the ideal, that it is perfect. It is very much not. As I mentioned earlier, that of course it is an experiment located in Europe, and this partly is not like as an individual's fault of sun management or anybody, but this is a result of global geopolitics and these power structures, right? Not all passports are created equal. And so if it's a large international collaboration, how do people travel? And also it's related with the state of socio-economic development, with the state of educational and scientific infrastructure in one's native country. And so right now, like it's still the collaboration is still very much like a white male majority, and it's a Europe and North America dominated project, and particle physics in general is such a profession, and that is probably also not so different from a lot of other branches of physics. And so how do we democratize a scientific profession on a global scale? That is a very important question, and that is a responsibility of the scientific community, of the political policymakers, and also just of civil society and society and the public in general. And also like just even at sun itself in Europe, like a very immediate example for because the experiment is built on the border. There are many of my colleagues, they may live in France because the rent is cheaper. This is the French countryside, but they may have their civil services like their doctors and on whatever shopping, and they do it on the Swiss side. And then with the COVID pandemic, when Switzerland and France began to enforce this border, and then it created actually very significant problems. And so this is an example of how just like when we are still living in a world that is segmented by borders, and nations have the ability to enforce it for various reasons. For pandemic control, it can be a valid reason, but one also needs to understand that the national border is not a medical boundary. It is not the most optimized boundary for containing a pandemic. It's simply because it is the boundary that is aligned with organized state power. So that is the boundary that is most easily and most stringently and first enforced. And so these are all realities we have to contend with. And I know I've given a really long answer to this question, but I also wanted to point out on one thing that I think it's still a lesson that we can reflect on today, is that during the Cold War, we mentioned earlier how Red Scare described a very particular thing of a particular era. During the actual Cold War, when the Soviet Union was largely by its own design closed off to the West, and there were scientists at CERN first, and then particle physicists at CERN, and later also particle physicists at Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory here in the U.S. and it's located just outside of Chicago. And a lot of these particle physicists did leverage their institutional prestige and leverage their political connections and lobbied their national governments and created these channels for Soviet scientists to come work at CERN first, and then later also in the U.S. at Fermilab at the National Laboratory to collaborate on fundamental research. And that was a time, because of the Soviet Union's own design, that the Soviet scientists cannot travel freely, and they would travel with their their government minders, and that carried a degree of security risk, but that risk was weighed against the benefits, and it was also a time when the world was on the verge of nuclear war. And actually, like having these kinds of conversations open between U.S. Nuclear and particle scientists and Soviet scientists, and understanding what each other is doing and was actually constructive to peace. And so I think that was an important lesson that has particular relevance today as well.
Do you think on that, it's interesting because, you saw these scientific collaborations, you saw, the U.S. and Soviet Union cooperating on space-related stuff, getting into the 70s and 80s. That the impetus to use science as a bridge, you don't see a lot in 2021. Even though, as you just mentioned, like the world seemed a lot scarier and like the risk of nuclear war was probably higher back then than it is today. Is there something about, the way the world looks between the U.S. and China where, no one is really that scared of some existential crisis that you don't see anyone advocating science to be used as this sort of bridge?
I'm hesitant to paint it this way because the world was certainly much more divided then. And then again, like I said, the primary reason was because of the nature of the Soviet Union and also like China then as well. It was the Mao government's own policies that then forbade Chinese nationals to travel overseas. And so I think at the time when the world was structurally divided, and there were some of these channels that by some very brave and motivated individuals that were pushing it open. The world is not like that today, right? There is a lot more integrated, and in terms of science and technology, education and commerce in particular. And I also think it is very important if we look back at that era. And immediately after World War II and during the Cold War, right? And if we think about Operation Paperclip, where the U.S. government recruited large numbers of former Nazi scientists to the U.S., and the operation was called Paperclip because there were people who were members of the Nazi Party and have fought for Germany, not necessarily in the trenches, but like contributed to that effort and would not pass immigration scrutiny. But they were scientists or engineers and had these particular skills that the U.S. found helpful in its Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so they would, U.S. officials would put a paperclip on their immigration files to mark these individuals to help them pass through these security screenings. And of course, most notably, it was Werner von Braun, who, of course, was instrumental in the U.S. later space program. And so I think this is the issue of nations and national governments trying to appropriate science and use that as a tool of state power is something that is really not new. And I think it is always inherently dangerous. And what I do worry now is that with this kind of rhetoric, that both the United States and China, the governments and a lot of the public rhetoric as well are really sound quite similar. There are linguistic styles that are a bit different, but they really sound quite similar in terms of national competition, national power and science and technology for national leadership and whatever. And that is I can understand how like politicians may say that because of the constraints of their role, but it's something that I do think civil society, academia, the scientific community have an obligation to reflect on and at times to push back against. And it is a very dangerous mindset to think that the problem is not bombs, but whose bomb. And that comes back to what I mentioned at the very beginning, right? When Judith Butler posed this question, what makes a life? What makes a loss? What makes for a grievable life? Bombs and weapons that would kill people. And if the people are equally grievable and possess as much humanity, then that if we come from that starting point and then use that to evaluate how science and technology are being used and how scientists conduct that their work, I think that is a much more responsible standpoint. And otherwise, if we cling to a national framework, then it is inherently exclusionary and at the end of the day, logically inconsistent and intellectually dishonest.
Going back to the rhetoric that we use, the terminology that we use, we were talking about the new Red Scare, and you kind of broke down each word of new Red Scare that you took issue with. Are there other words in the discourse that you have issues with, or terminology that we use? And I'm thinking here more specifically, like you meant like chilling effect or brain drain.
And the flip side too, Yangyang. Are there any phrases in the contemporary discourse about U.S. and China and technology that you think are apt in any way?
Yeah. So I know that again, like I would acknowledge that a lot of people who use these words come from positions of good intentions, that they are alarmed by this heightened scrutiny and with a racialized tint, and I want to push back against it. And then at times they may also resort to a ready-made language or language they assume would be most persuasive to policymakers let's say here in the US. But I think I just like as an academic and also as a writer, like language is important, and a language can enforce biases, but then language used in a better way can also contest these structures of power. So let's say chilling effect. I would say like these a lot of people say these heightened scrutinies and the China initiative, these prosecutions and other forms of restrictions have a chilling effect on scientific collaborations and scientific activities in the US. I think that it's not like it isn't factually probably correct, but it gets to the point is if a chilling effect is bad, the inherent assumption is that the hotter the better. But that is not true, right? It's not that more science is better or always better, and it's a lot of work that it's not that it's not just quantitatively more that is just always welcome. This is where like the competition narrative is dangerous, because a competition would assume there is two sides. It would enforce a boundary, and it will also impose certain metrics, which almost always falls down to some kind of a quantitative measurement. But that is a rather actually irresponsible mindset, especially in terms of developing science and technology. When there are serious ethical concerns, when there are issues with safety and with the ways these new technologies may be used, whether it is in artificial intelligence or in biotechnology, and these potential harms actually cannot be constrained by national borders. I think actually the COVID pandemic is a great example of this, that these inherent risks cannot be contained by national borders, and so it is really important to actually, sometimes it's not just like scientists who think, oh, we will do this because we can. But should you, and is it good? Who funds it? Who benefits from it? Who could potentially be harmed? These are the questions that needs to be asked. And a lot of times maybe slowing down is good, and not just good, but also necessary. And so this is where I think the chilling effect, even if it may be nominally correct to say, enforces a potentially dangerous perception that the hotter the better. And then coming to brain drain, right? And I think this is a terminology that I really, really dislike to no end. And I really, and it's also a really, really ugly term, just right? It just in terms of language, in terms of aesthetics, it's almost like a violent terminology that is at its core dehumanizing. Like, I'm not a brain, I'm a person. And I think there are two layers why a brain drain is problematic. The first related to what we've discussed earlier up to this point, right? And it has this connotation that somehow science and technology are instruments of state power, and scientists are state assets. are these assets in geopolitics. And so like a country would try to accumulate more as if like scientists are some form of like rare minerals. And then the countries, like the US or China, will compete to extract more and create this form of hegemony over it. That is a very, very parochial and indeed a very dangerous mindset. And it's not a good thing for one country to have a monopoly over any branch of science or any group of scientists. It is actually diversity, including geographical diversity, are very important in the safe, ethical, responsible, sustainable development of science. And the second layer on outside of science and geopolitics is the terminology brain drain also enforces this idea of quote unquote a good immigrant. And that is, it again also enforces its national borders and assign people a value, a score of whose body is desired and who is not, and who by trading their degrees, their education, their skills, their labor, or even their stories can purchase this ticket across a border. And if we believe fundamentally that migration is a human right, it's not a privilege, then terminology like brain drain should be fiercely resisted.
Yangyang, can you wash some of the ugliness of those phrases out with a passage and close this episode with a reading as well?
Yes, and since we were talking about science and technology and the use of borders, I thought I would read a few paragraphs from an essay I wrote for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists for their 75th anniversary issue that was published last December. And the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, I should also mention, was founded by Manhattan Project scientists in the fall of 1945 when they were reckoning with the costs of their creation and on the critical relationships between science, scientists, and state power. The title of the essay is called The Edge of Our Existence. The coronavirus came from nature. It has no morals, no agenda or belief. Its presence among our species is a result of human activity, a reminder of our disruptive power and our ultimate vulnerability. No armies or weapons, material wealth, or political borders can protect us from changes in the ecosystem. As we continue to expand our presence on Earth and exploit it for short-term gain, as more areas become uninhabitable due to flooding, drought, or fires, as melting glaciers and warming seas awaken ancient pathogens, what's happened in 2020 is only a prelude to much worse to come. The face of our planet is shifting. We are all becoming displaced. It starts at the margin. The most vulnerable are the first to feel its impact. The way we respond to their plight will determine our own fate. If we cling to old ideas of citizenship and creed, if we use the pretense of scarcity to justify our bigotry, if we let migrants drown at sea and refugees languish in camps, it won't be long until we realize that we too do not belong anywhere. If we are determined to shape our identity through the destruction of a collective other, we are only ensuring our mutual demise. The state of our humanity is not measured by the richest or the most powerful, nor can it be understood by listening only to those safely at the center. The border is not an edge, but a new beginning. The ones who have persevered in the periphery hold the key to our future survival. Their presence disrupts our comfort, challenges our norms, uncovers the paucity of our moral imagination. Their voices, the forcibly silenced and deliberately unheard, enrich our vocabulary at a time when the enormity of the truth puts us at a loss for words. The liberation of the most oppressed will necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. The empowerment of the most disenfranchised will empower us all.
Yangyang and Alex, thank you so much for being a part of China Talk.
I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say say 'em loud, say 'em clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be free. I wish I could give all I'm longing to give. I wish I could